Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mings, and today I'm going to be talking about something that is very near and dear to my heart. Today we're going to be discussing live games on Advanced Wars by Web and how to get better at them. And in case you don't know what that is, it's basically an Advanced Wars match where you're on a timer. Usually you start out with 5 minutes on the clock and you gain 2 minutes for every turn that passes. It may sound like a lot, but once you get into the late game it can actually get pretty hectic. The closest things that I have to compare it to would be Blitz chess, which I've played a lot of when I was playing professional chess back in the day. And I think my love of Blitz chess is also why I love live games, because it completely changes the way you play Advanced Wars. And I think a lot of people don't realize just how much it changes the game. Now, I am far from the best Advanced Wars player out there. If you want some really good tips on how to improve your standard play, then you should head over to DJ's Productions and check out some of his guides. But I will say that I am pretty decent at live Advanced Wars. I play quickly, I have a good knack for managing my time, and so I felt like it was appropriate for me to make this little video. Today I'm going to be teaching you 10 tips for how to improve at Advanced Wars live play. Let's get started. Number 1. Treat your time as a resource. If you've been watching my replays where I cover my live games, this will be something that you're familiar with because I say it very often. Your time is a resource on par with your funds, your income, your unit count. Every single second that ticks down on that clock is a second you will never get back. So use it wisely. Now, I'm not saying this to stress you out. I see so many people wasting so much time thinking out their build order when they absolutely don't have to. It may not seem that bad at first when you got like 12 minutes left on the clock, but 10 turns from now, you're going to be playing on increment, which means that you only have 2 minutes to make your moves. And by that time, your IQ is going to drop by like 70%. When you play on increment, you struggle just moving every single unit on the map, and you can't really take the time to make good calculations and make good attacks. So treat your time as a resource. For the first 10 or 12 days, just yeet. Yeeting is a term for just move your units. Like, keep an eye on what the enemy is doing. If they're building battlecopters, obviously you should respond with anti-air, but it's far more important for you to just do something and accumulate that time so that you can use it when it really matters. There's going to come a time in your match where there's going to be a huge attack and you really need to calculate it. If you've saved up 15 minutes on the clock, you can actually bust out the move planner and do some calculations. Again, time is a resource. If you save it wisely, you get to spend it wisely later on the match. But if you spend 7 minutes thinking out your build order, you're not gonna have that time for when you really need it. So treat your time as a resource, don't waste it. Play fast in the early goings of the game where you don't need that much brain power to think out your moves, and then spend that time when it really matters. Tip number 2. Know how time affects COs. When you play live, some COs are better, some COs are worse. I'm going to give you a few examples. Rachel is a tier 3 CO, but in live games, she almost jumps down an entire tier down to tier 2. This is because Rachel's missiles do not require a lot of brain power to use. When they're ready, you kind of just hit the button and they do damage to your opponent. Meanwhile, the person you're playing against has to really carefully position their armies to bait missiles. This takes up a lot of time. They need to manage their infantry properly. They might even be forced to go into the move planner to see where the missiles will land to soak them properly. This not only drains your opponent's time, but also their brain power. It is exhausting to go up against Rachel and constantly have to move around her missiles. Furthermore, you don't even have to activate the missiles. You can sit on them and force your opponent to play very awkwardly, as they can't really group up, they have to stay spread out. Other COs that are just blatantly better in live matches are any COs with global damage, because there is not really much thought required to hit the button and do global damage. It's a CO power that just kind of works for you passively without you really having to do much thinking. So any CO with global damage is going to do really well in live games. Another CO that is much more scary in live games in Fog is Sonya. Sonya is very annoying to go up against because in standard matches, you can actually calculate her hidden unit's HP by just doing some damage calculations, and if they're on terrain, you can actually see how the terrain interacts with her reduced HP, and you can actually calculate just how much HP the unit has left. but you can't do that in live games. You don't have the time to do that. So her question mark HP, you just kind of have to gamble, and that's incredibly frustrating to go up against in live matches. So I would definitely advise giving Sonya a try if you get queued up in a tier 3 fog match. Then we have an example of a CO that gets worse in live games, and that is Eagle. Eagle is hard to use because when he pops his lightning strike, he effectively has to do an extra turn, but he doesn't get any extra time on the clock. So that lightning strike sucks up a lot of his time, and if you go into a long match where there's like 2 or 3 lightning strikes, Eagle is going to start to really sweat as that timer ticks down. So I really wouldn't advise picking Eagle in tier 2. You certainly can, but it's going to be a handicap. Number 3, memorize important calcs. Calcs stand for calculations, and it basically just means that you should have in your head a rough idea of how much damage your units will do. There are certain benchmarks that you hit in terms of firepower that will allow you to do some things which can really make it easier for you to break through enemy walls. At 20% firepower, your infantry can 2-shot enemy infantry on cities. The same goes for tanks. If there's a tank on an enemy city and you have 2 tanks and you have 20% extra firepower, those tanks can now clear out that tank on the city, which is very, very important to know. At 30%, your artillery can now one-shot enemy infantry on planes. At 40%, your anti-air now one-shots infantry on cities. Very important for busting through walls. And at 50%, your normal tanks now one-shot enemy infantry on planes. These are just a few calcs to keep in mind. There are more, but I think by far the most important one to keep in mind is the plus 20%. 20% is the benchmark you want to reach with firepower. So whenever you go into a match, the first thing you need to do is to take note of how many comm towers there are per player. Some maps have 0, some maps have 1 per player, other maps have 2 per players. And then you're gonna add your CO's firepower to that mix. So for example, whenever I play Jess, I always make sure to get my first comm tower as quickly as possible, so I get that coveted plus 20% firepower on my tanks. Now I can 2-shot enemy tanks on cities. This is very important for busting through walls and for taking down enemy forces that are situated on rough terrain. So the more you memorize the calcs, the better you're going to be in live games, because you need to know these numbers on the fly. You can't just constantly look them up. If you do that, you're going to run out of time. Tip number 4, limit your indirect usage. Indirects are great. Knowing how to use artillery is what separates a good player from a bad player, and on some maps, artillery are absolutely invaluable. In live games, they are a lot less valuable. I'm not saying you should never build artillery. There are some maps where artillery is going to serve you well, but they are hard to use in live games. It's more difficult to make a good wall. You're more prone to just making mistakes and getting your artillery killed. So my advice to you, at least when you start out playing live games, don't go too heavy on the artillery, and definitely don't build rockets. You need to just rely on your tanks and your melee units for a little while, and then once you feel more comfortable, you can start incorporating artillery into your mix. But be careful, indirects are a lot worse in live play, and you are far more likely to get them killed than to get valuable engagements out of them. Tip number 5, tech up in the late game. Once the match progresses into the phase where both players have like 20 to 25k income, and you start to see a lot of big units moving about, you should absolutely focus more on the big expensive units like neo-tanks, bombers, and mega-tanks. Why do I say this? Well, in the late game, it's much better to have a low unit count with high-tech units than to have a bunch of small, weaker units. Why? Because you're on the clock. Now, of course, this advice needs to be taken with a grain of salt. There are definitely situations where you want a higher unit count, but in the late game, once that timer starts ticking down, instead of building like 3 tanks, build a neo-tank, or just build a bomber and infantry. It's going to serve you a lot better. It's just going to be better for your timer. So tech up and focus on strong units rather than building several weak ones. Number 6, know when to go Scorched Earth. Scorched Earth is a strategy that refers to a player sacking their own units to damage the enemy infantry. This is usually done when you're about to lose an engagement in a certain area and you have vulnerable properties that the enemies threaten to take over. So what you do is you just sacrifice a couple of your units to damage your opponent's infantry so that they can't really take over those properties. So they may win the engagement, they may win unit value, but they're not going to turn it into an economic advantage, at least not right away. And usually, damaging their infantry gives you time to bring reinforcements down to said area, so that you can prevent them from taking over the cities. Or at the very least, you can delay them from taking the cities long enough so that they won't get a big advantage out of it. The reason why this is incredibly important in live games is because live games are usually played with a timer. You have 30 days. I don't know if they're going to keep this when the rated live system comes around, but I think they might. So let's say you are on day 24. There are 6 days left, and you are 1 city ahead of your opponent. At that point, you should just go 100% Scorched Earth, target fire their infantry. Doesn't matter what kind of units you sack. If you can destroy every single capping infantry on the map, they literally cannot win. So, especially in live games, you need to know when to go Scorched Earth. I wouldn't do it on like day 10 or day 11, because at that point, there's still plenty of time for your opponent to get back in the match and capture your properties. But once the match goes above day 20, just target fire the enemy infantry if you're ahead, or if you're behind, make sure you keep your own infantry alive and go for the enemy properties, because at that point, it's going to be a capture battle. Number 7. Use time as a weapon. This is a bit of a cheesy strategy, but if it works, it works. Say you're playing a normal game, and you notice that your opponent has maybe half as much time as you have left. You have 15 minutes on the timer, he has 7 or 8. At that point, what you can do is just hunker your units up in a defensive situation, build up a bunch of units, place your infantry in front of your vehicles, and go into a stall game. Your opponent then either has to attack into your fortified position or do the same. Very often I find that they do the same. So what you can do then is you can just wait out your opponent. Statistically, he's going to run out of time before you do. If he plays as quickly as you do, he's going to be on increment when you're on 7 to 8 minutes. So you wait until your opponent is on increments, and then you attack. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that you now have like 10 minutes to calculate out your attack, and your opponent has 2 minutes to respond to it. And this really goes back to the first tip that I talked about, which is treating your time as a resource. Now, you can basically use all the time you've saved up to choke out your opponent. The attack doesn't even have to be that good, because your opponent only has 2 minutes to respond. So it's a bit of a boring strategy, it's a bit of a cheesy strategy. I'm not sure if I would do this in like a show match or a tournament, but if you're just playing to win, it's a completely viable strategy and one that you should absolutely consider. Number 8. Think on your opponent's turns. This is one of the first things you get taught to do when playing blitz chess. And it may sound kind of dumb. I mean, for some people, like, oh, think on your opponent's turns. Don't you do that by default? And the answer is actually no. A lot of people do not do this by default. They just observe, and they don't actually think, what should I do once my turn starts? Once you're in that mindset, you will actually find that you may have twice as much time to think, because sure, observing your opponent is important. You want to see where he is placing his units and whatnot. But a lot of people don't actually use this time wisely to think, okay, what units should I build next turn? Here's the thing, not everything your opponent does will impact your next turn, especially in like the first 10 turns or so. Your build orders and movements are largely independent of your opponents. This is doubly true if you're playing fog matches, because you literally cannot even see what they're doing. But what I see a lot of people do when they play live games is they just sit and watch the opponents, and then when their turn rolls around, they spend like 15 seconds going, what should I do? Why didn't you just take those 15 seconds during your opponent's turn to think about what you should do? Whenever I'm playing a live match, I am sitting during my opponent's turns and I'm looking at my units, thinking about where I should put them. Now, of course, sometimes your opponent will do something that requires you to change your tactic. So you need to do 2 things at once. You need to observe your opponent, but you also need to plan out your turn. Again, it may sound pretty dumb, but I promise you, it is a mental shift that you need to do in your head. Don't just observe your opponent. Don't just sit there and watch. You need to also think, what am I going to do once my turn starts? And when you're playing against an opponent and you click end turn and you see they start moving their units immediately, that's how you know you're going up against an opponent that is using your turn to plan out their strategies. And it's a very important thing to do. Number 9. Learn the luck mechanic. The luck mechanic is integral to Advanced Wars, and it is important both in standard and live games. But I find that knowing intrinsically how luck works makes my live play much better. On the surface, every single unit will deal 0 to 9% extra damage in battle. This allows infantry to remove low HP vehicles. It can even allow a bunch of your infantry to wear down an enemy battlecopter. It is extremely important to always have luck in the back of your head whenever you make engagements. Now, of course, there are some COs with additional luck damage, like Nell and Rachel and Flak and Jugger, and I don't know if they're going to be allowed once Rated Live comes around on Advanced Wars by Web. They are allowing Nell in Tier 1 in unrated live matches at the moment, which I find very enjoyable. I don't know if they're going to keep doing that, but either way, you should absolutely memorize the luck mechanic. I'm going to do a bit of a shameless plug here, but I did make an entire video covering the luck mechanic, and that video is still very relevant to this day. I'm going to link it up in the top right corner of the screen. Go watch it if you haven't. It's a video that I spent a lot of effort crafting and one that I think is very informative. So definitely make sure that you memorize luck values, that you have luck in the back of your head. It's going to make you better at live play and standard play both, but especially live play where everything goes really quickly and you don't have a lot of time to sit down and calculate these things. Number 10, download the sound plugin for Advanced Wars by Web. I cannot stress enough how many times I have heard a recon briefly move through my vision and not seen it. This is because I use a special plugin for Advanced Wars by Web that plays unit movement sounds whenever they move around. Now, this add-on isn't cheating, by the way. It won't display the movement sound unless the enemy moves inside your vision. This add-on is integral if you like to play live fog games, and it's pretty nice to have otherwise too. I like the little sound effects that it makes. It just makes you pay more attention whenever your opponent is moving, and it makes you more invested in the match. I just think it's a great add-on that everyone should have. I will link it in the video description below if you want to go check it out for yourself. So those are my 10 tips for how to improve at live play in Advanced Wars by Web. I'm going to include a bit of a bonus tip. I didn't want to include them in the top 10, but just breathe. Seriously, live games are stressful, and I notice a lot of the times when I'm playing that my posture will stiffen up and I'll sit like this and I'll stop breathing. That is going to make you lose games. Remember, whenever your turn starts, just make it a habit to go. Just take a deep breath. Trust me, getting fresh oxygen into your brain whenever you're playing is going to dramatically improve your plays. Anyway, guys, let me know if you enjoyed this video, if any of these tips helped you out in your live play. And remember, you can go queue up for live games right now if you want. My name is Mengs. Please leave a like and a comment and subscribe for more Advanced Wars content, and I hope to see you guys in future matches. Bye-bye.